Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Faerie Conclave. I'm your host, Alec. My pronouns are he, him. This is episode 102, and I'm super excited to be welcoming back an extra special guest. It's Jarom. How are you doing today, Jarom?
Hello, everyone. It's Jarom. My pronouns are he, him, and oh my gosh, I'm back on the Faerie Conclave. What an epic day this is. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me back, Alec.
Oh, me too. Okay, so for anyone out there who maybe started listening to this podcast recently, or maybe this is your first episode or something, this is really exciting because Jarom was an original co-host of mine of this podcast. So yeah, I can't remember exactly how many, but if you listen to it's the first 50 or so episodes.
Yeah.
It's me and you. So yeah, welcome back.
What an epic journey it's been. I think I had to step away from the Faerie Conclave as hosting because I had a baby in my life and was graduating school, so there was just a lot going on, and sadly I had to say goodbye to the Conclave. But Alec, you've just done such an incredible job with it, and I think I love seeing the Faerie Conclave thrive, and it's definitely been one of my proudest things that I've been able to say I was a part of originally, and so I'm really happy to see that you're just marching forward with just, in such a wonderful manner. So I'm just so happy to be back.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, no, I definitely could not have gotten this podcast where it is today without your help for such a long time. So yeah, it's definitely props to you as well for all of that.
How many years are we coming up on? How long has it been since our first episode?
Yeah, so actually I forgot to talk about this before we started recording, but this is great. Yeah, one of the reasons why I wanted you on this episode specifically is because it'll come out on January 24th, 2024. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly 4 years since our first episode aired. So yeah, if you can believe it, we released our first episode January 24th in 2020. So
wow.
Yeah, happy 4-year anniversary.
We literally our first episode was in some small broom cupboard office on campus at the University of Utah, and just huddled around a computer sharing a single mic. Holy cow.
So funny.
What a journey.
Yeah, it's so funny to think about. So Jarom and I met at the University of Utah. We were doing the same bachelor's degree at the time. And and then we kind of realized we were both into Magic, started playing Magic together because that's what you do when you're instead of studying when you're
classic
when you're at college. Yeah, and then we had a laptop with, I think we literally just had headphones plugged into it, and we just huddled around the headphone mic.
Yeah. Yep. That's
so
exactly
funny.
What happened.
So funny. And also a weird time. I think we recorded 2 or 3 episodes in person, and then it was 2020, so we promptly started recording from home, and then we just kept going until here we are.
Yeah.
Doing this podcast has brought me so much joy every time I work on it, and it definitely helped during times like that. So and I also wanted to say that if you remember, I had you on episode 76 where we talked about how to play mono black decks in Commander.
Yep.
And I wanted to give you an update on that. That is it's consistently one of the top 5 most listened to episodes of this podcast of all time. So props to you again for being a mono black deck expert in Commander, and apparently giving great advice.
I don't know if I'm a mono black expert, but I would say black is definitely my most favorite color of the color pie. And so just knowing that black is getting the love it deserves, that's what brings me the joy right there. So
same. Yeah, it's really cool. I love seeing every week I get a here are the top 5 or 10 kind of most listened to episodes in the last week, and the majority of the time one of those is that mono black episode, which I think is so funny because usually it's just the newest ones, and then, so it'll be the newest ones plus that episode is always up there. So maybe we'll have to revisit that topic someday and do a part 2 or something.
Oh yeah, I could talk about mono black for days. So You let me know when, and I'll be there.
Okay.
Or
Sounds
you let me know
good.
when you release it, and I will listen to the heck out of it because anything mono black, I am there for it. I will consume
Same.
freely.
Same. Yep. Well, and to kind of pivot from there, today I will be interviewing you about one of your commander decks, and it doesn't include black this time. So it'll be
I
a little different.
I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed, but that's
That's
okay.
okay.
We can't be perfect all the time, I guess.
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, sometimes you have to branch out as a deck builder, as a player, and yeah,
Yeah,
this is
I
a
agree.
perfect example. So okay, yeah, and really quick before we get into the interview questions I've got for you, I'm gonna do a shout out for one of my patrons at the Conclave Mentor patron level, and so today's shout out for this episode will go to Lunchbonks. You know who you are, and I love you. And thank you for being a patron. If anyone else wants to come be a patron, I just added a new tier recently where you can just you can sign up for $1, and I think that's nice. For $1 a month, you can show your support, and it means a lot to me. So yeah, check it out. Without further ado, let's get into the deck interview. So Jarom, my first question for you is, who is the commander that we're going to be talking about today, and what inspired you to build this deck in the first place?
All right. So the commander, I should say more the deck that I'm going to be discussing today is Tameshi Midnight Dumpster Diver. So the commander is none other than Tameshi Reality Architect. And I'm just going to give this a quick read for y'all, just so everyone's on the same page. So Tameshi is a 2 generic and a blue legendary creature Moonfolk Wizard. And whenever one or more non-creature permanents are returned to hand, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. That little clause right there makes me a little sad, but anytime I see card draw in the command zone, I immediately gravitate towards it. And then the last ability is X and a white. Return a land you control to your hand, and then return target artifact or enchantment card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. And Tameshi's stats is 2/3. So I remember there was my all-time favorite deck of all time is Grenzo Dungeon Warden. And I was like, I need to branch out and find a creature that gives me almost the same level of joy as Grenzo does. And so I was looking for creatures with activated abilities. So the reason I love Grenzo so much is he has a great activated ability. And so when I found Tameshi, what immediately pulled me towards this commander was A, the card draw in the command zone, and the activated ability, which I thought was fun. And so from there, I don't think I'd ever built an Azorius deck. So I just started throwing together an Azorius pile, and it just turned into a bunch of artifact and enchantment trash that just gets thrown around with Tameshi, and that's
Nice.
how I ended up where I am today.
That's really cool. Like, reading this card, as you were reading it, there are a couple things in here that I don't think I'd ever really noticed before that make it really cool. So it's whenever one or more non-creature permanents are returned to hand. I didn't realize that wasn't just your own hand. You can like bounce other people's stuff to draw cards too.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like up until the last few years, Azorius, they've always had kind of the same style or same kind of strategy, or very like pretty similar. And this is like totally different. It's like a landfall-ish artifact enchantment matters, but like recursion from the graveyard thing. And yeah, that's just really unique. So I'm interested to see what you've done with it, because like reading this, I don't even know. There's like a lot going on, and I don't even know what I would do going forward. So yeah, I'm really excited to get into how this deck even works.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of fun stuff that I'm excited to point out and go into. And I think probably my favorite part about Tameshi recently has been diving into some really old cards that I don't think see a ton of play, that I'm like, you know what, this card's kind of weird, and it's just enough that I want to put it in Tameshi, and so it's really forced me to look through different cards, and I feel like I've learned a lot about some really old Magic interactions that I've just really loved having in here. Whether or not it's good, I don't think it's that. It may not be the best, but it's fun, and that's what's important to me. I have a lot of fun playing it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That is important. And Yeah, honestly, one of my favorite things about Commander is when you find a legendary creature that fits really well with some weird old cards that don't see a lot of play. That's just like, that gets me. That like makes me want to build a Commander.
Yeah.
Whereas this one, it's like, okay, this new Commander from 2021 goes perfectly with all of these cards from like 1997. And I just think something about that is really beautiful.
Yep. I agree 100%. So I'm excited to talk about some of these old cards and interactions and how we use them in Tameshi.
Perfect. Yes, me too. So, okay, so my next question for you is, what is a little bit about this deck's history? Like, what kind of changes and what kind of realizations have you had over the years as you've played it?
So the first thing that I think most Azorius players come to realize one day, and I'm still on this journey, is as fun as Azorius is, you need a win condition. So, and I don't mean to hate on any Azorius lovers out there, but I feel like when I first built Tameshi, other than like maybe one infinite combo, I realized that what I'd put together was a bunch of fun cards, and then I would play it and I'd realize, oh crap, like other than like I'm having fun, but my deck, it needs a way to close the game, it needs a way to cross the finish line when that opportunity presents itself. And so over the years, as I've worked with Tameshi, I've tried to put in cards that I feel like can help push me towards the end rather than just control the board and drive the game into the 2-3 hour zone of game time, and I feel like this Azorius list definitely can do that and has done that. I'm not saying I've solved that Azorius conundrum by any means, but I feel like the big takeaway that I've had as I've played this is I need to have silver bullets in here. I need to have ways that I can close the game so I can keep my friends as friends and actually, be able to close out a game. I love, dirtling with some of the interactions in here, but also I think it's important to put a period at the end of a game and, especially for Azorius and close up. And I'm not saying all Azorius decks are like that. I may be thinking more of like some standard lists, but Azorius in general, I guess. So.
Well, I'll back you up there. Honestly, from what I've seen in a lot of cases, I think most decks, like regardless of their colors, could just use more win conditions and like finishers.
Yeah.
And
for sure.
Yeah, and I think myself included, I have a lot of decks where I will do 1,000 things each turn and it feels so cool and I've drawn a bunch of cards and then I just do kind of the same thing next turn and I don't really know if I got anywhere. And I think that is a good thing to keep in mind for people out there who are playing with a lot of the new precon decks, because a lot of recent precon commanders have a card draw kind of effect on them, which is great and we love it. But if you're just kind of like doing this thing to draw a few cards, extra cards each turn, you have to actually, have the cards in your deck that will get you closer to winning the game instead of just drawing more cards. And so, and I think, there are some decks, like I've played against the Clavileno Vampires deck quite a bit recently, which has a similar, it's like do some stuff and draw a card, but it also has like Blood Artist in the deck, and it has other kind of like vampire-y ways of making your opponents lose life while you're doing all of that. And I think, we're not in black, so that's not available, but just like some way to add power to the board or to reduce your opponent's life total while you're doing all of that other stuff is definitely something to keep in mind. So you can actually, exactly like you said, so the game doesn't go 3 hours before you finally like claw your way to victory. Yeah,
and I will be honest, I consider all my opponents conceding a win condition. And I know that sounds really scummy. But I think, again, I've talked about this before. One of my favorite tools in Commander is politics. And I feel like this deck is perfectly geared to be a political manipulator. And we can talk about that a few questions down. But, I've had games with this deck where my opponents conceded and we just scooped up and went to the next game. Not because I've reduced everyone's life total to 0, but because I've locked up the board state or I've set up a pseudo win condition where it's like, we can play this out or we can just scoop it up, which I guess is also very typical Azorius, but it's one tool in the toolbox that we can use,
Definitely. Yeah, and I think there is a like it's totally fine to just be like, you know what? I don't see a way out of here without it being very slow. So let's just scoop it up and we'll have a rematch real quick. I think in a lot of situations that is totally fine. I feel like sometimes that's a bit stigmatized to concede, but honestly, you know, like someone if they need to leave, like they have work in the morning, like you can just concede. I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah.
No worries.
Yeah. And I recognize saying that it makes me the bad guy, and I'm okay with that. I think I accept all of the, the weight of that burden of stating that, and I make that clear when every time I play someone, we sit down and kind of discuss what our decks are about. I'm like, this deck is won with people conceding. And as long as we're on the same page with that, like, let's march into a game, and so I think keeping communication open in that regard definitely helps people from being surprised when a board state like that is set up. But
for sure.
As far as, I also kind of navigate the game in a direction, or at least from my deck's perspective, maybe sometimes to fit a certain play style or play group, just so it's a bit more cohesive. But
gotcha. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned. I'm glad you mentioned that, because the communication is, I think, extra important when you're playing a deck that has ways to lock up the board and do things like that. Like I was defending you earlier about having people concede, but I did just scroll down and see that there's a Mind Slaver in this deck. So I don't know if I can defend too much, but
that's okay. That's all right.
That is something that as long as you're not, catching people off guard or trying to be like deceitful, I guess, about what the deck is doing until you're actually doing it, then it's totally fine. Because if you tell me a little bit about what your deck's doing, there's a Mind Slaver in here, there's some ways I can kind of like take over the game and kind of bring it to a standstill, I'd be like, oh, I want to see that, let's play it, thank you for warning me before we were halfway through a game, and I'm like, wait, what? So yeah, very important.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the history of how it's evolved from just very, kind of young Azorius, just all the good Azorius stuff, to kind of a more looking at older cards, finding some weird interactions, to where we are now, which can be kind of a mean lock down the board deck, but it's fun. So I enjoy it.
Nice. Yeah, I love it. My next question is like, what do you like most about playing this deck? Is there anything else, maybe like the goals you have while you're playing this deck? Yeah, what is it about it that has just kept it around for so long for you?
So looking personally, knowing my Magic history, the decks that I gravitate towards have a lot of triggers and can play on other people's turns, meaning I have interactions that can be used on my opponent's turns. Because I think there was at one point in my life where I had a game where, and no offense to Kalia players, I love Kalia of the Vast, but I had a Kalia deck where I played on my turn, and then I literally just sat there and waited like 45 minutes till it finally got back to me again. And it's like, I felt like I had no control. I was like, I want to be able to have interaction and do things on my opponent's turns. And this deck, I love how many triggers I can use, especially on my opponent's turns, to influence the game, use politics. And so that's definitely my favorite thing, is that it's not play something, play big creature, attack, pass the turn, and then I have to wait 3 turn cycles till I get to do anything again. And no offense to green players, I'm not saying Big Stompy is a bad strategy. I'm just saying, for me personally, I love that there's a lot of little machines and triggers that I can set up with this deck.
Gotcha. I really enjoy both of those kind of ways of playing a game in different situations. Like at the start of the night, the first game, we're sitting down, like my mind is fresh and ready to go. I want a very like interactive deck that when you have instants and abilities you can activate on your opponent's turns, I feel like I'm more engaged with the game because I'm like forced to pay attention to what everyone's doing, and that just makes it a more engaging overall experience. But then after like 5 or 6 games, maybe a couple White Claws, I'm like totally fine breaking out the green deck that just plays
Yep.
one creature per turn and then swings in for damage. So it's like a little bit of a different situation, but I definitely
Yeah.
I feel like I'm more I'm just like in it a little bit more when you're forced to pay attention to what's going on your opponent's turns rather than like, setting your hand down and leaning back and being like, all right, hopefully nobody wipes the board before my next turn.
Exactly. Yeah, and I feel like when I've definitely played this deck at the beginning of the night and the end of the night, and I feel like I was able to maneuver it to be it's flexible in that way too, which I like. Is I can be like, hey, how can I optimize this situation? Let's calculate the best route forward, or we can be like, you know what? I put this artifact and enchantment on the battlefield, and then I pass it.
Yeah.
And I guess the last thing I'll say is I love how many cards this deck can draw. I love having a full hand, and I love being able to use the graveyard as part of like card advantage. And so I like having a lot of options. It feels very toolboxy, which
nice,
is what I enjoy about it.
Yeah, and I've come to appreciate a kind of toolboxy type of deck lately because I've been going to a lot of events and playing with total strangers all day long. Like I'll play 14 games in a day, and every single game will be with a completely different group of people and different decks.
Sure.
And I just have way more fun. And which, before I started going to events, I was playing with my same play group every week. I knew all of their decks because I played against all of them several times. I just knew kind of like I didn't need to be as toolboxy because, like I know what I'm up against. But with random people, I have a lot more fun trying to kind of like maneuver the game state and figure out what to do when you have like a variety of options and different paths to take depending on what's going on. So yeah, this is the kind of deck I think would be really good in that type of environment where you just don't know what you're playing against and what your opponents are going to be doing, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, and just real quick to allude back to one of the previous questions, which was this deck's history. I feel like this is the deck that I've done this the most with, where I'll have a game, I will lose horribly to a certain card or an interaction or a board state, and I'm like, I didn't see a way out of this with the current deck that I have. What changes can I make so the next time I find myself in that situation that I can at least look for that solution? I think that's how this turned into a toolboxy deck where, this deck doesn't win a whole lot, but when it does, it feels very calculated. I feel like I saw this coming. I know I have this answer. It's got to be in here somewhere. Oh, I just drew into it. Let's try and set it up and approach it like I planned. And so I like having, I guess that's how it kind of evolved into a toolbox deck is, every time I would lose, I would try and think of a way. Oh, I did have a way out of that. I just didn't draw into it, or I don't have a way out of it. How can we change that? So
nice. Yeah, that's really cool. And especially in blue and white, I feel like those two colors have a lot of interactive answers to pretty much anything. Whereas a lot of times I'll get blown out by artifacts or enchantments when I'm playing a mono black deck, and I'm like, well, there's like Feed the Swarm maybe would have helped, but besides that, there weren't too many options. But yeah, it's nice that you're in blue and white, where when something messes you up, you've got options for things to change in the deck to help for next time. So.
I mean, there's always counterspell here, and so that it's kind of a catch-all in blue. But I definitely see what you're saying, and Azorius is well equipped to have that mindset with deck building and adjusting a deck for being a toolbox deck.
Totally. And I think to kind of go back to this ability, which we haven't gotten into too much, but it is like recursion. So you're kind of playing like a black style strategy where you're bringing stuff back from the graveyard.
That is
in
true,
blue
yeah.
and white, which is kind of cool. Yeah, so tell me more about that. Like what are some of your favorite artifacts and enchantments to return? Yeah, what's kind of like the value that you can get from that?
There's definitely a bunch, but I think the one that I think is the most useful that I love seeing anytime I draw is Aether Spellbomb.
Oh.
So Aether Spellbomb is a 1-drop artifact, and it has 2 abilities. The first ability is blue, sacrifice it, return a creature to its owner's hand. And then the second ability is colorless, sacrifice it, and draw a card. So this is one of my favorite artifacts in this deck because it's cheap. I can recur it easily with Tameshi, and it's just like putting a gun on the table. And usually I don't, because people are always scared of getting their commanders bounced or their key creatures bounced. And the beauty of that is I rarely need to use this to bounce the scary stuff. And so if someone has a 5/5 dragon they just spent 6 mana on, and they're like, do I attack Jarom or do I attack this other opponent? I'm like, hey, if that comes at me, I'll just bounce it. And so they go, okay, I'm going to swing the opponent. And then at the end of their turn, I just sack this and draw a card and then bring it back on my turn. Nice. And so that's kind of the flow of gameplay that I use. And usually if I have to use it, I will to bounce a problematic creature. But I've been surprised at the mind games that this card will play with people. And there's a similar card, it's a Seal of Removal. It's an enchantment that I can sacrifice to bounce a creature to hand. But I think Aether Spellbomb is just a bit better because I can draw a card off of it if need be. But these two effects are just so nice to be able to abuse with Tameshi and really play that mind game with people of like, oh, is Jarom going to bounce my creature, my commander, or do I swing at him and see how he's feeling? Or so that's just a simple example of an interaction that I love to abuse with Tameshi's second ability, where you return a land, draw a card, bring it back, and then go from there.
That is so cool. It's kind of like a one card like synergistic combo with your commander. And and I think you're right. I think the threat of activation of this is something that will give you so many little advantages in a game that you can't really track or calculate. But I'm sure if you have this out like pretty early in a game, it'll kind of in some ways like gain you a lot of life because they're not attacking you, and it'll divert to your opponents. But then also you don't lose any value there because you can just draw a card. If you don't need to activate it, you can just draw a card and sacrifice it. So that's really cool. I had never really thought about how sweet that is.
And I think another card I'm going to give another mention, it kind of fits into this category, is actually Dress Down. And the reason Dress Down is so good is, A, it has Flash. It's an enchantment. When it enters, it draws a card. And it says creatures lose all abilities. And then at the end here, it says, at the beginning of the next end step, sacrifice Dress Down, which is supposed to be like the downside of this card. However, that's actually a pretty good upside for Tameshi because I want to be able to draw that card again. And so I'll flash this in at a key moment to maybe shut off someone's combo or prevent a big attack or something. If someone has flying or something or double strike, I can flash this in, kind of, mitigate a little bit of the problem. And then it dies, it goes to the graveyard, and then Tameshi can just bring it back when they need. So it's kind of it's been a surprisingly good card to use with that second ability.
That is so sweet. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that I am into, and that's why I love doing these interviews. Is any commander that kind of turns a card's downside into an actual upside and like take advantage of it, I'm just like, I'm all about that. That's so fun. Another
card that has, so cumulative upkeep, Mystic Remora. Can draw a ton of cards if you get it down early. But I don't care if Mystic Remora dies. So it goes to the graveyard. So usually I'll put this out, maybe draw 1 or 2 cards. Beginning of my turn, I won't pay the cumulative upkeep, send it to the graveyard, and then just bring it back. And then it resets that cumulative upkeep counter. And then I'm just able to, keep, that value engine of just drawing cards on other people's turns up. And so that's been another one where, the seeming downside of cumulative upkeep, you use that to your advantage, where you send it to the graveyard and then just bring it back with Tameshi.
As though Mystic Remora needed to be any better. That makes it much, much better. That's awesome. So one thing we haven't gotten into yet is one of the costs of Tameshi's ability is you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand. How does that affect your gameplay? Because I feel like it could potentially make it so that you are a little behind on mana. But yeah, I want to get your thoughts on that, where that goes.
So first off, I am gonna milk it as much as possible. Obviously, we've all been in games where your opponent is like missed a land drop 2 turns in a row and they're really behind, and everyone's like, oh, you know what? I'm not gonna swing Billy. He's not hitting his land drops. And so obviously that's not usually the case here because it's my own doing. But I will say that anytime I can lean into that, I'm going to lean into it. And I feel
Mm,
like that's another tool of politics that you're using. You're like, oh, poor me. I only have 4 lands and everyone has 7. But this deck is, I feel like the way I built it, I've never been in a situation where I'm hurting for mana or hurting for lands. And I'm glad you asked that question because I actually want to point out a card here that has been an absolute all-star in this deck for basically addressing what you just brought up, and that's
mm.
Archaeomancer's Map. So let me go ahead and read
Oh,
this. So Archaeomancer's Map is 2 generic and a white for an artifact, and it says when it enters the battlefield, search your library for 2 basic plains cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, and shuffle. Great. And then it says whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player controls more lands than you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. This
uh,
happens every single turn. So usually at the end of my turn, like I'll have 4 lands out, my opponents will have 7 or something. And then by the time it gets back to me, I'm all caught up. I have all the lands in play because they're just in my hand.
wow.
And then all my useful cards are in the graveyard. And so then I just bounce them all back to hand and then we just replay it, that exact same scenario. So this card has just been incredible for making sure my land total on the battle, my land presence on the battlefield stays healthy, and I can have mana to work with in the end game.
Yeah, this is perfect for this deck, especially because it is an artifact. Like
Yeah.
I've
Oh yeah.
definitely blown up an Archaeomancer's map or two in the past, and that just doesn't work here because then you can just get it back and then get all your
Yeah.
lands back. That's
Oh
really
yeah.
cool. I was gonna say you also have some lands with like enters the battlefield abilities or other effects that you can use
Oh yeah.
you can just use over and over again, which I think is also a really cool thing here.
Yeah. I definitely will. I mean, there's the classic bounce lands when they enter, return a land to hand, which again, that's kind of a downside. But with Tameshi out, like when you play Azorius Chancery, you bounce a land and draw a card. And then you have a land drop for Archaeomancer's Map, yada yada. Tranquil Cove, gain some life. There's just a bunch of ways to just little small pieces of advantage that are super helpful in a game. I will say probably one of my 2 favorite lands that I love to loop and just use over and over is the first one is Mystic Sanctuary. So when it enters, if it enters untapped, I may put an instant or sorcery card from my graveyard on top of my library. So I've had games where I'll play Mystic Sanctuary, put Counterspell on top of my library, and then, draw it, counter something, and then just keep bouncing Mystic Sanctuary to get that
Mm.
Counterspell back into my hand at least once a turn cycle, which again is a huge mind game to play with people. So I love using that ability over and over again. And this is another old card that I was kind of referring to earlier, and this card is called Ghost Town. It's a land. Have you ever heard of this card before?
I don't think so. I'll be honest. I like
Yeah,
the
I'll,
name
I'll
though.
yeah, I'll give this one a read. It's
Yeah.
it's definitely a unique one. One of my favorite land artists, Tom Wennerstrand. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Some of my favorite art is by this individual, and so I was super happy to put this in here. But it's a land. It taps to add 1 colorless mana. Okay, cool. And then its second ability is for 0 mana. You can return Ghost Town to its owner's hand. Use this ability only during another player's turn. Sometimes Tameshi's I don't ability where anything gets bounced to hand, including my opponent's stuff. Sometimes my opponents don't have stuff that's getting returned to hand. But if I have this in play, during my opponent's turn, I can pay 0, return it to my hand, draw a card. And then they play a land, and then Archaeomancer's Map will trigger. I'll put this back into play, and then on my next opponent's turn, I'll repeat that process because I only can draw 1 card per turn with Tameshi, but this way I can draw a card during each opponent's turn to just keep a healthy hand, even on, drawing cards on my opponent's turns, which I just think is so silly and it's just my favorite thing to do. So that's why I want to give this card a shout out, because I think it's so fun.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I was talking about earlier, where just these weird old cards with abilities where you're like,
Yeah.
why did you even what did you think people were going to do with this card at the time? But now, you know, we've got these cool new cards that can take advantage of things like that, and I think I just think that's really neat. And then you also have the opportunity to just play things like Zhalfirin Void as a land, which you would never really play normally in an average commander deck. It's just a land that adds colorless mana, and when it enters the battlefield, scry 1, which is like fine. I mean, you're not going to be mad about that in a normal deck, but it won't really help too much. But in this deck, scry 1 every single turn, every time you pay the cost and use Tameshi's ability, like that ends up being really, really good when you scry 10 times over the course of a game.
Yeah, it really helps dig for the right answers. So there's a bunch of unique lands. We could spend a bunch of time talking about it, but you know, just Scryfall Advanced Search land that has the phrase "enter the battlefield" on it, you know, and you'll find a whole plethora of them. And I don't even run them all in here, but there's a bunch of cool ones for sure.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot of how this deck works and how it can be really strong, but now tell me a little bit about what this deck's weaknesses are when you're playing it against other people.
So I'd say one of the biggest weaknesses is when people have really big, go wide, like token strategies. So we mentioned earlier, like Aether Spellbomb and Seal of Removal are great when someone has like a big dragon or a big commander or one key creature. But if they have 100 1/1 goblins, you know, Aether Spellbomb doesn't do a whole bunch. I feel like when someone goes wide and starts to, you know, overwhelm, you know, the board with creatures, this deck has some answers, but its main strategy isn't to go wide. And so anytime someone swings me with more than 3, 4, 5 creatures, then like my life total is going to drop because I'm just not equipped to deal with that, at least immediately. Gotcha. So I'd say that's one of the biggest weaknesses that I've noticed. But, you know, there are ways to help mitigate that, but that's like a single card. And so the overall strategy definitely suffers to strategies that go wide on the board as far as creatures are concerned.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that is kind of a classic struggle that decks, when they just don't have a lot of creatures, like this one's dealing in enchantments and artifacts and kind of like sorceries and instants to a lesser extent, like way more than it's playing a bunch of creatures. And protecting yourself against go wide opponents is just going to be something to keep in mind.
There's also, you know, some certain cards or problems like Farewell. If someone's like, you know what, I'm just going to exile all graveyards, all enchantments, all artifacts, that's a huge setback for me. What are you going to do? I think it's good that it keeps the format healthy to have cards like that, but I definitely lean into the fact when people build commander decks, they're like, oh, I'll include 1, maybe 2 enchantment removal spells. This deck has so many enchantments that doesn't matter, and I'll just bring it back. But when someone exiles it with like Farewell, that's definitely a weakness that this deck has, is losing its some of its enchantments to like exile, because then I just don't have access to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this is kind of, I feel like if I were playing against you playing this deck regularly, then I would start putting more exile-based enchantment removal or graveyard hate in my decks.
Yeah.
So yeah, makes sense.
I encourage it.
I love that.
That's really funny.
Nice. So, okay, so what would you say if you were to choose one card to be the MVP of this deck? Would it be Aether Spellbomb, or is there maybe some other cards that you would consider MVPs as well?
Well, there's so many cards that interact so well with Tameshi, and I don't know if this is going to be the MVP. Well, I'm trying to decide here. I'm going to start with one that I think is the MVP because, no, you know, that's the later question. Oh, as far as All-Star goes, some people might hate me for this. I'm going to talk about Mana Breach. I think this is one of the best cards that I've had in this deck. And so Mana Breach is an enchantment, 2 generic and a blue. It says whenever a player plays a spell, that player returns a land he or she controls to hand. This card is just a house. It is mean for my opponents. It draws me a ton of cards. It slows down the game to a point where I can be in control. I don't really even need to play spells on my turn. I've had this out, and people, like, this is a downside for everyone. It's symmetrical. But I don't even need to play spells. I'll just bring stuff back from the graveyard with Tameshi. I don't need to bounce my own lands. I'll do it on my terms, and then I'll just ship the turn, and then my opponents are just forced to just tax their own mana while I'm drawing cards. And this one is awful, but it is so good in all the right ways for Tameshi, and I think this would have to get the MVP position for sure.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's true. This is something that kind of warps the entire game around.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like being very careful about making sure the spells you're casting are worth the huge cost of returning a land back to hand, and then you have to kind of like plan your mana around that. But then for you, you're thriving. You're drawing a card each time, which like more than makes up for that. So it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's just something that like your opponents are going to have to deal with that or figure out a way to move forward while bringing their lands back to hand. But most decks are not prepared for that situation. So yeah, that's a really good one. I like that a lot. Even though it might be a little rude, I think I still think it's really cool, and the synergy with your commander makes it really cool as well.
Yeah. Oh, it 100% is rude. I admit that. I recognize that. But the synergy is just too good for me to ignore. So that's why I say
yeah, for sure.
And I'm giving, most synergistic card for sure.
Totally. Yeah, I see that. Okay, so I noticed you kind of getting into this next question a little bit already, but let's do it. Time to shout out some of your favorite pet cards in this deck.
Oh, yes. Hands down, Zur's Weirding. Are you familiar with this card? Have you ever?
Not at all. No, okay. I'm not.
I'm going to read this, and I am so happy I get to read this on the Faerie Conclave. And I want to spread the good word of Zur's Weirding. So Zur's Weirding is an enchantment for 3 generic and a blue. Players play with their hands revealed. No secrets. Everything's out there. The next ability it has here is if a player would draw a card, he or she reveals it instead. Then any other player may pay 2 life. If a player does, put that card into its owner's graveyard. Otherwise, that player draws a card.
Wow.
I want to get your reaction on this before I talk about it. So what are your thoughts?
My first thought is that is so political. Like every time.
Every time, on the same page.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I could definitely see how that would be really funny. Where every time someone draws a card, they like put it out on the table, and then all the other players are like, what should we do? It's like you're setting up a little council every time.
Yep.
And that's funny. And then you have to figure out like who's gonna pay the 2 life, like who's the most worried about whatever the card is, if it's good. But then for you, it makes sense that you're fine with it happening either way because you can just pay to get it back out of the graveyard. So that's not even... Okay, I kind of like this. I feel like it definitely will probably slow down the game quite a bit because everyone's
100%.
Yeah, everyone's kind of like they have to discuss each card draw. So there's that, but I could see, kind of similar to the last card we just talked about where it's so synergistic with your commander, and I could also just see this being fun. Like kind of funny. It's like, let's see what everyone's drawing and we can talk about it. Like I kind of like that.
It is so much fun. But exactly like you pointed out, the price is it slows the game down. And ironically, this is one of the cards that has, I'm not going to say won me the most games, but I will say has ended the most games because so many people I've been surprised. So many people are willing to pay 2 life for just the darndest of things. And so I played this card where life totals were sitting around the 30 range for several turns. And then this comes down, and in 2-3 turns, everyone's life totals getting down to around like 10, below 10. And it just, someone else sometimes may capitalize on that and end the game. Usually that's when I try and capitalize on it and end the game. This card, Zur's Weirding, has a best friend in this deck. And this best friend is the enchantment called Second Chance. And I'm just going to read that real quick because it's kind of an oldie but a goodie. It says, during your upkeep, if you have 5 life or less, sacrifice Second Chance and take an extra turn after this one. So for our friends at home, if my life total's below 5, I can, in essence, keep bringing this back every turn and keep taking an extra turn. Indefinitely, which is super nice. And, Zur's Weirding definitely helps drive my life total down to a range to turn Second Chance interactions on. It's definitely It's a fun combination that whenever I get to set it up, I try to go for it. But it can be a little difficult to set up. But if it's there, why not go for it? So that's something I really enjoy.
Okay, the more we talk about this deck, the more I'm realizing this is just a hidden black commander deck, Jarom. Like, you're paying life to take extra turns. You're like using your life as a resource, getting down to below 0 or below 5, close to 0 with Zur's weirding. I love that. And that's just something like, if I were looking at this deck list, I would not have noticed a lot of these things. So yeah, that's why I love getting your insights into how all of these things work together. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd say that's probably my pet card in here. Nice. And luckily it works with the commander, but it's just a fun card.
Do you have any other spicy cards you want to shout out while we're kind of going through individual choices of cards in this deck?
Yeah, definitely. I think one that is one of my favorites is Soul Tithe. And this is a really good interaction spell, or not spell, enchantment. Like I said, it's a spell, interaction. I just love this card. And so I'm gonna read it out. So it's an enchantment aura, and it says enchant non-land permanent. At the beginning of the upkeep of enchanted permanent's controller, that player sacrifices it unless he or she pays X, where X is its converted mana cost.
Huh.
So I love putting this on someone's Smothering Tithe or their Soul Ring or even their commander, anything really. And so basically it really taxes my opponent's mana. And eventually when they're like, you know what, it's not worth it, I need the mana, they let their Smothering Tithe go to the graveyard. Soul Tithe goes to the graveyard, my graveyard, and then I just bring it back and put it on someone else's thing. I've had games where it's in essence like a time walk ability, because I had an opponent one day who was like, he just really wanted to keep his Smothering Tithe. And so every turn he would pay 4 for it and be super limited on mana and then pass the turn. And so this card was just, really good at kind of keeping a single player at bay as long as you do the right assessment of targets and stuff. And so, but it's not like a card that immediately just gets rid of something. It forces my opponents to make hard choices, which is why I love this card so much.
One thing there that's really interesting is, like, you cast this on on my Smothering Tithe, and I'm like, okay, well now I feel like I'm responsible for this, because if it goes back, then it just goes, Jarom will just cast it again. So now I kind of have to like keep it here, even though it hurts. Yeah. Okay, I really like this because you're right. You could just be playing a removal spell, but this adds a lot of like decision making to the game. Which and you're kind of fine either way. You're like, it's bad for you no matter what you do, and I'm fine with it. So yeah, I think that adds a lot of intrigue, which is fun.
Yeah, just a couple more card interactions that I think I really love. I think one of my silver bullets in this deck, which I've actually never been able to pull off, I'm still waiting for the day that I can, and that's just Solemnity, Decree of Silence, which is just a combo where Decree of Silence says whenever someone would play a spell, my opponents would play a spell, counter it, and put a counter on it, but Solemnity prevents counters from going on enchantments. So it, in essence, just locks my opponents from playing spells. It does cost over 10 mana to get up and running, so I don't feel too bad about running it. I've never been able to do it, but I just love Decree of Silence so much that I had to put it in here. It's kind of like, it's a silver bullet that I have if the game just is going sideways. I've never been able to pull it off, like I said, but it's nice. I feel more comfortable knowing it's in my deck.
Yeah, it's always fun to have, and I know personally, you've been a fan of Decree of Silence for a long time, so this deck does seem perfect for it. And that's one of those things where, like, this is in my deck, and if it happens, you're probably not going to be able to get out of it. So, and I honestly think every deck should have some kind of way to just some kind of like silver bullet, like you said, where this will end the game or save my life or something. But like you said, it's 8 mana for one enchantment, 3 mana for another enchantment, and that is more than enough for I'm like, you can do whatever you want with that much mana, and it'll it should be ending the game or getting close to. So yeah.
So the next one that I've really come to love is I used to run the enchantment Embargo in here, and Embargo says players don't get an untap phase. I took that out because I didn't like it as much, but this I love a lot more, and this card is called Mist of Stagnation. It's an enchantment that says permanents don't untap during their controller's untap steps. And it says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player untaps a permanent for each card in his or her graveyard.
Oh.
So this is perfect it leans right into my strategy. I like to have a healthy graveyard. It slows down my opponents, but also it doesn't completely lock them out, if that makes sense. It's not a stasis effect. It lets my opponents, they can adjust their strategy so they can fix their board state. Like, I'm going to let my graveyard fill up, and then I'll be able to untap more stuff.
I don't think I've ever seen this card before either, which you're just like blowing my mind with new cards today. But yeah.
All the old ones.
I like this one because then it also disincentivizes your opponents from like Bojuka bogging your graveyard.
Yeah.
Or I guess not Bojuka Bog because that's just yours, but like Scavenger Grounds maybe is a better example where it exiles everyone's graveyards, but they need their graveyard. So
right.
Yeah, it's kind of like a little interactive in that way too. Very specific, I guess, but I think that's kind of fun.
And I conveniently also run Soul Guide Lantern in here, so I can, if I do have this interaction, I can exile just my opponent's stuff. Soul Guide Lantern is great because it's a 1-drop artifact that I can use to draw a card when I sacrifice it, so I can, reuse it for card advantage with Tameshi. But I can also have Mist of Stagnation out and then sacrifice Soul Guide Lantern to nuke everyone's graveyard, so only I get to untap stuff. So it's a little cheeky, but it's a 2-card combination. But usually when I just have Mist of Stagnation down, it's pretty fun. I think it forces a new element on the game that forces like my opponents to make hard decisions, which I think is a fun aspect of a game for sure.
Yeah, and I can kind of imagine when you're playing this deck, a lot of these card choices will kind of put you in a position where your opponents are very disadvantaged, and then they have to kind of work together to overcome whatever's happening that was caused by you. So you might be like a little bit of an arch enemy, but I also really like when games are collaborative like that, when you have your opponents kind of like
100%
trying to work together to figure out how do we get rid of Jarom's weird 5-mana enchantment from the 90s. Like,
exactly. I'll be the bad guy every time. I love stuff like that.
That is so cool. Nice. I am excited to hear about this. Do you have a favorite like in-game moment that you've had while you were playing this deck?
Just last weekend, actually, it was with Zer's Weirding. You know how when you have a board state where there's just everyone has 20, 30 permanents and you're struggling to keep it all in a single playmat? I just thought it was so silly. On top of all that, everyone tried to fit their 5 to 7 card hand on top of that. It was just so chaotic. Again, I didn't even win the game. I just remember that moment of being like, wow, there's literally like 300 plus cards on these 4 playmats collectively, and I'm all about it. So I think that moment is definitely one that's going to stick out in my mind forever, just because I remember thinking like, this is just hilarious.
That's so funny. Yeah, I always love things like that where I often joke, I'm like, oh, now we get to see your deck list when somebody's like milling a bunch or for whatever reason just showing a lot of their deck. And that's like, that's exactly what happened with everyone's decks. It's like, okay, now I get to see everyone's deck list. Like, let's see what's going on. That is so funny. And then you wish you had one of those like 8-foot long play mats so that you can spread everyone's boards out.
Exactly.
Awesome. I like that. I like that.
One more fun moment that I have to shout out is there's a card in here called it's a 2-cost enchantment for 1 in a blue. I know exactly what it does. I can probably just read it. And it says the next spell to be it's hesitation. That's what it is, of course. It says if any spell is played, counter that spell and sacrifice hesitation. So this also looks at my stuff as well. So if I play this on my turn and then I try to play another spell, it'd be countered. What I love so much about hesitation is I had a game where I put it down and then all of my opponents didn't want their stuff to get countered. And so they were like, you know what, we're going to stick it to Jarom and I'm not going to play anything. I'll pass. And then just each of my opponents did that and they got back to me and they're like, okay, like, you have to pop the hesitation. So your stuff gets countered. And then I just, you know what? I'm just going to bring stuff back from my graveyard with Tameshi, and then I'm going to pass to you guys again. I'll let you guys go through that whole hassle again. And it was just like, a 2-mana time walk effect
So
that
funny.
basically locked, because it's just like the gun on the table. It's the fear of getting your stuff countered that really warps the game. And then the best part is when someone does pop it, come back to my turn and I'll bring it back and we'll go through it all again. So I think that game in particular was just a fun showing of how Tameshi interacting with these really old, crazy enchantments is just so much fun.
Truly, everybody was hesitating with that on the board.
Exactly. So those are two in-game moments. My favorite, I'd say.
Yeah, such a unique thing to happen. Like a lot of these effects, you just don't see
right
normally. Yeah,
Seriously.
very very unique situations. This deck creates a lot of board states that you just would never run into in most other decks, which I think is really unique and really cool. All right, so over the course of this episode, if anybody out there is like super interested in this deck or this, a deck similar to this, or just building Tameshi in general, what advice would you give to those people?
I would say A, don't be afraid to play mean cards, and B, communicate with your play group. Once you play those mean cards in there, it really brings a weight to a game. And when someone sits down to play Commander, they're like, this is going to be fun. I'm going to play this deck that I just built, and I want to see it do its thing. Oh, Jarom is shutting down the board and slowing us down. Boo-hoo. So I think being able to play these fun cards, these old cards that are weird, it locks up the board and shuts down other people's playing, that's okay. I wouldn't stray away from that. It's okay to be the bad guy. But as long as you follow up with the communicate with your players, your play group, because then everyone's expectations are met as far as fun goes. And, maybe the solution is you don't play Tameshi this round, you play it next round. So I think just being flexible and being open with your play group is really important. And I think that's one of the greatest things that I've learned playing this deck. And I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces of advice that I would share to anyone maybe looking at this deck or this type of play style.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the open communication about what your deck is doing is just, it's important with any deck, but especially when, just like you said, if you're doing things that are weird or unexpected or game warping, that's just something you want to make sure people are on board for, because if they're not, you're like, okay, I'll just break out Grenzo or play a different deck. Right. Totally fine. Nice.
I like usually people don't like to be locked out with Mindslave or something, but if they know it's coming and we can figure things out, then it's good. As long as everyone's expectations are met and everything's fun, that's what's important.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that's great advice. Nice. Well, thank you so much, Jarom, for letting me ask you a whole bunch of questions about one of your favorite decks. I had a blast, and this is definitely a weird one, so I'm glad absolutely. That we went through it. It's like, I don't know, it's just such a Jarom deck. Like,
It really is.
It really is. And it's making me miss playing against you, because it's been too long. I need to get a game in with this deck with you soon. Is where I'm going with that.
Yeah. For those who don't know, I've moved out of state. I now live in New Mexico. So maybe when I get back to Utah, Alec, we'll jam a game in just like old times.
Yes, please do. I know you'll be visiting at some point, so let's do it.
Well, thank you so much for having me back on the Faerie Conclave. It's just been so much like just good memories coming back. I absolutely love talking Magic, especially with you, Alec. It's just been an absolute treat. So really, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the pleasure is all mine, honestly. This has been just like the good old days, and I'm so happy we could make this work. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So for anyone out there who, I'll have the link to this deck list in the episode description, but yeah, Jarom, do you want to shout out any of your socials or anything else you've got going on?
I'm not really big on the social side because I'm boring, but I'm just going to say communicate with your playgroup, everyone. Be kind to everyone, and I love Magic, and thanks for having me on. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you, Alec.
I love it. Yeah, I could not think of a better way to sign off an episode, so awesome. Yeah, and before we wrap things up, I always shout out all my patrons at the All That Glitters level, and we have one currently, which is Jeff. So Jeff, thank you so much for being a patron. I really appreciate it. Yeah, Jarom, one last shout out to you. I love talking to you about Magic. So yeah, hopefully others out there enjoyed hearing us talk about Magic. And I'm excited to do it again in the future. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you again on the next episode.